Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Martina, as Jan announced. I'm a mobility reporter here at Politico, and we're here today to talk about the decarbonization of trucks, heavy-duty vehicles. This has been an item ever since it landed on the EU policy agenda, an item that has been one of contention, that it brings penalties for the sector. It's really, really important, and the transition is not going as fast as it would be necessary. It shares some of the problems that are common to the EV market, the car market, but it has a very particular structure in itself. It's a business-to-business sector where the cost of ownership is really important, and it has external competitors that are really, really competitive in that sense. And I think it's really good that we got to have this conversation now, because we've seen in the past few days attempts or showing of different parties in the sector trying to either push for the latest policy item, which is on the agenda, which is the greening of corporate fleets directive, to be presented on time, or either waited or delayed. And I think it's really good that we have the experts here to talk about it. Let me introduce them. We have Felipe Rodriguez, who's Deputy Managing Director for Europe of the Heavy Duty Program at the International Council of Clean Transportation. We've got Raluca Marian, who's EU Director at the International Road Transport Union. And we got Thomas Fabian, who's Chief Commercial Vehicle Officer at ASEA. And so I'd like to start with a simple question, a quick-fire question, based on the background of the item that we're discussing. So truck heavy-duty decarbonization is based on the CO2 standard, the EU CO2 standard, and that is a contentious item in itself. So my first question would be, and I'd ask you to respond in a yes or no, and then a quick reason as to why. Do you think that the CO2 standard should be maintained, yes or no, changed, watered down, or not, and why? And we can go down the line, starting with Felipe.
Okay, so yes, it should be maintained. There has been some hiccups around the policy framework that exists in Europe, but it's a very comprehensive one. So starting to question the CO2 standards, which is the core of EU's industrial policy to decarbonize trucks to move towards electrification, would not be a good climate policy, but also be terrible industrial policy. So you don't dismantle the bridge whenever you have to do some road maintenance. You keep what's holding the whole framework together. So yes, absolutely, we need to keep those and not create uncertainty by reopening those ahead of time.
Raluca?
Martin, I think that you are trying to polarize us from the very beginning, because you want some sparks here, like in the previous panel. No, they should be changed. And I give you a very simple reason. We are talking about demand mandates. So there is a big fear that the other mandates are not met. So we are talking about market intervention. If the other mandates can't be met because the conditions, the enabling conditions are not there, then we have to adapt them until the enabling conditions are there and not intervene in the demand. So it's an answer in itself. If we are so desperate that we have to do market intervention, planned economy on the demand side, it means the first targets are too ambitious.
Thomas?
Well, the answer will surprise you. I would say yes, they should be maintained because they help create a level playing field and a direction. But, of course, I'm with you that there's at least two things that we think are fundamentally wrong with the CO2 standards, and that's why they should be reviewed as early as possible. One is the timeline. I mean, the timeline until 2030 is extremely short. So we need to talk about this because we depend on the enabling conditions. And the second point is the fact that we are the only ones being penalized massively if we don't meet those targets. And that is not a call for other actors in the sector to be penalized as well. It is just in this interdependent transport and logistics system, you cannot punish one actor if all of the other enabling conditions don't establish. So we need to accelerate the review as early as possible to correct those two elements.
I have a question for the one of you who wants to maintain the targets. If we do maintain them, and as Raluca was saying, there are problems in certain parts of the sector. There are things that are missing. If we maintain them, what do you think or realistically, what does the industry need immediately to be compliant, to be able to comply with the standards if we maintain the same timeline, as I understand that you advocate for, or if we don't, even if we extend. But if we do extend, what can we do in terms of transparency to avoid the late scramble as we're doing now? And we can start with.
Sure, I'm happy to. So the first thing for us would be that if we do maintain the standards, right, that we stick to a timeline that it allows a reasonable impact assessment, that allows the market to show the signals and to respond to the standards that we have today, right? So you mentioned 2030, right? But right now we have 2025. So in 2025 is when the first implementation step of these standards comes into force. So we have 15% reduction starting in July this year. And what we have seen from the market is it is reacting, right? So just in this third quarter of the year, the shares of electric trucks increased, shares in Denmark, Netherlands going very fast up, already 12% for heavy trucks. Some manufacturers hitting 6.5% of electric trucks, down from less than 2%. Daimler Trucks is this manufacturer. So we see very positive signs of the market reacting to the regulation. Manufacturers will not have to pay any fines in 2025. That is, the regulation is working. The flexibilities are allowing them to comply. So what we need to do is stay course, right? And then if there are any revisions that are needed to the standards in 2027, then those should be minimal, right? To enable a little bit more flexibility for manufacturers to comply, but not revising the whole framework that has been successful so far.
I'm tempted to say I agree. Because the point is indeed the investments have been made and they continue to be made in response to a large extent to the CO2 standards to develop the zero-emission vehicles. And just be clear, let's be clear here, the 25 targets are a totally different ball game than 2030. 25 targets can, I'm not saying easily, but they can be met with improving a lot of the conventional technologies. The 2030 targets as they stand today require that out of every 3 vehicles newly registered, 1 is electric, easily, one third. And to have, for transport operators to have that confidence to, yes, at least in one of 3 choices, the zero-emission vehicles are the go-to choice, the go-to option, means to have they need to be the better choice, the better option for them. And that means infrastructure and it means TCO, cost competitiveness. So it must essentially be a no-brainer to say, yes, we're doing this because it makes sense. And we're not there yet. And that's the problem. That's why we think the targets need to be revised. The Commission needs to look very thoroughly and honestly with the industry, we've been calling for this for a few years now, at where do we stand with the enabling conditions. We just published earlier this year a report about the state of the enabling conditions. There's a huge lack of transparency. Where's the charges? Where's the TCO competitiveness? And it's a complex industry because there are so many different use cases. So it's what works in one use case, Raluca, you will confirm this, doesn't necessarily work in another use case. But what we're challenging here is we cannot penalize eventually an industry, vehicle manufacturers, if things don't work out as fast as anticipated, despite all the efforts everyone is making. And just to give you one last number here, China is, again, is at 20+% in zero-emission vehicles, heavy duties. Impressive. They took 5 years to get there. If we apply the same China speed in Europe, which seemed rather unlikely, we won't meet the CO2 targets.
So I'm going to disappoint you, Martina, because I largely agree with both speakers. So I agree with Thomas. I don't think manufacturers should be penalized. But I also agree with Felipe. I think in many countries we see a very good uptake of electric vehicles. The problem, and this is our members or our members doing it. So we see companies having not 10%, going even to perhaps 100% of their fleet, depending on their operational model and what they do. Now, what is the reality, though, is that these targets are European Union-wide targets. So it may be Denmark, where the uptake is big, it may be some other countries, but the European Union can't move at different speeds in order to reach these targets. And this is what we're seeing now. And you asked what is needed, coming back to your question, to make this happen. So we are talking about enabling conditions, and these are obviously the infrastructure, and we are talking about alternative fuel infrastructure, so the charging as such. We are talking also about the grid, and we know that the plans to upgrade grids, we will have a grid package soon, but that will most likely be very light because we are facing a problem of union competence there. So in the sense that they can't oblige member states to do it. So it will take years. And we have examples of infrastructure projects at large ports, for example, which finish in 2035. And ports are very important hubs where you have tens of thousands of trucks every day going there. So these are big opportunities for electrification. But if the infrastructure is not there, then things have to be adapted. So we are not pleading against targets. Of course, it's not possible to go to reverse everything. So perhaps my first answer was misinterpreted. It's not against targets. It's for realistic targets, adapting the targets so that nobody is penalized if the enabling conditions are not there.
Of course, yeah. Going back to something you said, that Europe cannot move at different speed, I want to talk about what is currently on the table in Europe, which is the item for contentions, which is the greening of corporate fleet proposal. And specifically, one thing that has been floated, rumored, talked about, which may be part of the proposal, which is mandates. Now, mandates is a really complex topic. I don't want this to become a really complex discussion, but I guess the question would be, and I'm starting with Raluca because I know that as transport operators, of course, you'd be one of the parties most impacted or most involved if we're talking about demand-side targets and mandates. Do you think those are a good idea? And if you don't, what other measures could be adopted to accelerate the transition?
I'm very grateful to Jens Giesecke in the previous panel because he spoke about cars, but a lot of his arguments apply also, of course, for trucks. And not to forget for coaches, less for buses, because as we know, but that's very relevant in this discussion, buses are already subject to targets to the extent that they are subject to public procurement because they are part of the Clean Vehicle Directive. But the fundamental difference is that there we talk about state money. Yeah. And if states want to regulate what they do with their own money, that's fine. But when we are talking about greening corporate fleets, we are talking about private budgets and about private money, which is, let's be honest, a form of limitation of ownership right. When you tell a free market operator what to do with this money and in what to invest. So our sector says a clear no to any form of mandates in any form they may come. And this is for the reasons I already briefly mentioned before, because this would be a form of punishment, and in reality, they wouldn't even work. We heard before the discussion about e-fuels in aviation, and they say they have mandates on everybody, and it still doesn't work. So if the conditions are not there, it simply won't work. So why should we legislate more and more and more? Instead of working more on the enablers, we oblige more and more and more here and there, hoping that everybody will be in the end obliged. But in the end, it's the final consumer. And we can't oblige a final consumer to do anything. So we are just trying to pass on the obligation from one economic chain to another, hoping that at some point the whole thing will be solved. I think that's the wrong focus and the wrong strategy. The strategy should be focused on the enabling conditions. There must be a business case for everyone. So there should be a grid, there should be fair prices for electricity, there should be, of course, alternative fuels infrastructure. There should be support for everybody to bring this infrastructure and build it at depots, because that's something which hasn't been said until now. Our fear is very good for the public roads, but most of the charging in our sector happens at depots. So there is all private investment. Yes. So all of these have to be in place, the right tax incentives as well, and of course in tax incentives and tax measures in general, but also incentives as such for the fleet. But just one quick word on what was said before, because there are the ideas, and there are many ideas out there, and they are quite speculative at the moment because we don't know how this proposal will look like. So will there be mandates on shippers? Will there be mandates directly on transport operators? Will there be just some emission reduction targets set on member states? So I'll just very briefly mention the last one, which is member states, because it seems that now is the biggest idea which will save the whole thing. So why we believe this is also wrong? We believe, and as I said in the beginning, any kinds of mandates are wrong. It's because in the end, if they are put on member states, it depends on how they are put, of course. And again, it's speculative. But if they are put the way they are put in the Clean Vehicle Directive, then it doesn't help. Because in the end, it's just the EU not taking the lead in setting in directly, but expecting the member states to do it. Sure, yeah. And even if it is broader and they don't prescribe how to do it, of course, if the targets are so big, member states won't be able to deliver only with some taxation measures, because infrastructure is not there, that is not there. So then in the end, they will do obligation.
No, of course, of course. I'm going to stop you because we're going to come back to that. No, sorry, we're going to come back to that in a later question, and I don't want to spoil the surprise. But I wanted to ask Felipe what he thinks about it.
Yeah, well, mandates are tricky, right? So we do see demand-side policy as fundamental to be able to have a concerted move towards the electric transition. But any sort of demand-side intervention mandate, you need to do it very carefully, right? So we have experiences in the United States. The ICCT is an international organization, and in California, it didn't work that well, right? So they set mandates that were a bit too high, it created a market distortion. But then you talked about China, Thomas, and in China, demand-side measures, mandates, have worked quite well. So what we have seen is the central government decided, as part of their strategy, their planned economy, right? So it's a different universe. But they said, we're going to set clean transport targets for the steel sector, chemicals, concrete production, and transport, of course, some mining sectors. And that is what has driven this massive uptake of electric trucks, right? So what we see in the data is that most of the electric trucks that are being marketed in China today are tractor trailers, dump trucks, things that we don't see, concrete mixers, things that we don't see here a lot in our European roads. And the smaller trucks, kind of like the delivery trucks, they're not that electric, right? So the electric share is not that high in those sectors because there hasn't been this demand push, right? So I think it's important to recognize that there is value to the demand policy intervention, but it needs to be done correctly. And on the speculation that we also hear, right, whether it might be mandates on fleets, on shippers, or on member states, I think the latter one we would find that to be a terrific idea. Because what we see right now is a very fragmented subsidy landscape in different European Union countries, right? And then we see money in Poland that just doesn't get out the door, right? Subsidies that are just waiting there to be handed out, but the design of the subsidy is complex, the awareness of the fleets is not that high, so this would put the pressure up on the member states to get better at incentivizing those fleets, because the burden would be then on them to be able to meet that regulation initiative. We don't know what's going to come out. So we would see that as a very positive development.
I saw you were nodding at the fragmented subsidy landscape. So
Indeed, because unlike cars, and I'm grateful for the differentiation and nuance here, unlike cars, the truck market is a European market. If you do something on the national level, you create fragmentation, you create distortion. That's not helpful for trucks. So, and I'm also with you, Felipe, here. I mean, usually the truck makers, the industry and industry association would be the last one to call for regulation or for any kind of intervention. But I think we're all in this together here in this transition. And I mentioned earlier that there's strong interdependencies. We all depend on this working in real life, transport logistics. And that means the trucks need to work. It means that the operators need to be able to function efficiently. The ports you mentioned need to work. This is like a clockwork. So it's really important. And the point is, if we have now strong supply side measures like we do have with the CO2 targets, we need to find a way to accelerate demand, to stimulate the demand. We need to double down on the enabling conditions. So that's a prerequisite. And I'm with you, Raluca. We're not calling for purchasing mandates for anyone that doesn't have a business case. That would be stupid. We're not doing this. But I think, again, we should try to turn this discussion into something positive. Can we find smart instruments where it actually can work and where we can help accelerate this? And what comes to mind is you mentioned the buses, urban buses, city buses. Clean Vehicle Directive is outdated. So the targets in the Clean Vehicle Directive are ridiculously low compared to the CO2 targets that manufacturers face. Public procurement. We know public budgets are constrained, but about 10% or so, plus minus, of the of public budgets public procurement is 10% of the demand for trucks comes from public procurement. So there's an important lever to create a market. And if you think, for example, of the big construction site on Pont Schumann. That's public money being spent to remodel things. If there would have been a smart provision in the tender that says, we want you to use zero-emission vehicles when driving around when building this, we would have a bit of demand, which we do not have yet. And that, of course, would need enabling conditions. That would need charging infrastructure. That would need support measures and all of this. But we think there is again, we're all in this together. Those who buy the transport services, shippers, can play a role. And they've admitted this themselves only a few years ago, saying that, yes, we want to accelerate, we want to lead this transition. So let's find smart ways in a policy framework on the European level that helps accelerate demand for zero-emission vehicles.
Sure. And this is a follow-up question, and ties into what you were saying and the reason why I stopped you. If mandates are on the table, and if we hypothesize mandates in that sense, who do you think should be held accountable for non-compliance, and by what means? Because if we're talking about mandates on states or member states, or if we're talking about special instruments or policy instruments which are similar to mandates or may have the same effect to mandates, then how do we assure that that's going to work, that there's going to be compliance with it?
Mm-hmm. Well, they could put fines on transport operators, and then they need to take a business decision if they pay the fines or they buy the vehicles and they look at them if they can't use them. But anyway, so coming back to what we discussed before, because your question is legitimately a little bit tricky because it asks to choose and then to speak about enforcement. But I think before even we go there, because we don't have a proposal yet, right? We are discussing about a potential proposal. It's, of course, a very good idea. We will never say no to support. So if there is a proposal where instead of talking mandates, we're talking about greening of fleets in the stance of trying to create a harmonized framework to provide support of course, we would all be supportive of this kind of support scheme. So if we are talking about a support scheme and not about compulsion, which is either directly or via member states, then, of course, we are all on the same page. If, to the contrary, we are talking about compulsion, we just had a petition signed in very short time by 5,302 transport operators and federations, and we had several other thousands which we scrapped out because there were drivers. And I think they are very legitimate to sign because the unrest is big. But we said we wanted to be, fair and speak about companies and not yet go into the social aspects and drivers. But then it's a clear no. That support scheme, definitely, we need it. Yeah.
This is something that is also very common to the car sector, which is the external competition. And it ties into, I think, what we've been saying until now. The sector this is a B2B sector, it has a total cost of ownership problem, so it's not a secret that there are trucks, electric trucks or heavy-duty vehicles out there which are cheaper, and more often than not, they're Chinese. And so a question that has popped in many people's minds, and mine too, is if we do go towards decarbonization, we try to encourage this path, is there a risk for European manufacturers to be in some way put aside by Chinese manufacturers, which are cheaper, and may enter the market and in some way influence it or change it? And I want to ask this question, of course, first to Thomas, but I think it's something that has to do with everyone else also.
Thanks for the question. So, and that's actually something that we're really concerned about, because this is about decarbonization, yes, but it is also about international global competitiveness. And the interesting fact here is that for trucks, European truck makers, I mean, they're global market leaders. We have a 90+% market share in Europe. We have an 80-something% market share in the US and North America. We have an 80-something% market share in Latin America. We have a solid market share in Middle East and Africa, in parts of Asia. We have a less than 1% market share in China. And China has a 20-something% market share in zero-emission trucks. So our truck industry managed to gain this global leadership position because of first a strong home market and because of the intense competition we're faced with. That creates technology leadership in the end. Now, and what we're concerned about is that, again, the conditions for technology leadership in the zero-emission technologies seem to be a lot better in China, 20-something% market share, than in Europe. So our plea actually is, we need to accelerate the home market here. We need to be faster. We have Europe, and that's largely due to the transport logistics operators. We have one of the most efficient transport logistics systems globally. Lots of bottlenecks, lots of shortcomings.
Thank
we
you,
still need to
Thomas.
work on.
Thank you, yes.
But it's due. I mean, this is a joint effort. We need to defend this. If China is able to develop technologies that they can compete on globally, if the conditions are right, then we cannot sit idly at the side and watch this happening. We need to lead this, and that's why we need to be very careful with, very fast with creating the enabling conditions. We need to be very careful with not necessarily punishing the industry that's trying to deliver, and we need to be very smart with. And there's lots of caution that we need to apply there. With smart industrial policy, right? I mean, spending, to put it a bit bluntly, spending taxpayer money on non-European products is in certain cases is a difficult decision. So if everyone, to put it a bit more mildly here, if everyone along the value chain in transport logistics continues to pursue the cheapest, the most competitive, cheapest option, while we are pushed to do something, to deliver something that is not the cheapest, zero-emission vehicles, then we create tension, then we create a problem.
Well, I can say it's not always about cheapest. And I can give you, because we keep talking trucks, and that's very seductive, because of course they have the biggest share of the heavy-duty market, but we also have buses and we also have coaches. And in the bus market, in the city buses, right? I think 70% now in Europe is Chinese. And it's not because they were the cheapest, it's because they were the first, and cities were very fast with electrification when the European manufacturers, they were not there yet, and also because they are very good. So I'm sorry to say that, because I'm a European, although I'm representing an international organization as well, but they are very good. So we saw at even the awards at the exhibition, the largest European exhibition on buses we had here in Brussels, that a lot of awards went to the Chinese. So their technology for the battery is very developed. They have bigger range. It's not only the cheapest. Then on the coach market, which is rather a niche market if we compare with the big buses and the big trucks, but still it's a market, we see coaches around. The European manufacturers start only now with some prototypes, or I think only one company in Europe started now having like larger production. So it was only the Chinese that were selling in Europe. So you see they had the first move advantage. It's totally different for trucks. I think in the truck segment, the Europeans are already established. We have a lot of members and members that buy European trucks. So they are the first mover. Of course, the Chinese are coming too, and they start selling electric trucks too. But I think it's competition, okay? But it's not. We don't have the big competitive disadvantage that existed in the case of buses and coaches, where they were the first movers, and now the poor Europeans, they are trying to catch up. But it's very complicated.
And if I can just add, so I tend to agree with you. It's not only about the price, right? So when we talk about passenger vehicles, cars, right? So it is a consumer looking at the price tag, and that's how they make the decision. They don't think about the lifetime cost of those vehicles. In the truck business, they do, right? So it's the TCO, the total cost of ownership. And when they look, and we have had examples of new entrants to a very closed market in Europe, right? So Ford, for example, tried to come in with a truck, diesel truck, that was significantly cheaper, and it hasn't sold that well, right? Because it is not only the price of the truck, it is the fuel consumption, in this case would be electricity consumption, but it's also the whole network that supports that truck. So I'm skeptical that just because a Chinese truck is going to come they can come in at half the price, because they are already at those price levels, right? That is immediately going to create a jump from fleets to just buy the Chinese trucks, right? So what Lucie was saying with Peugeot and her family in the previous panel even more applies to the truck industry. They tend to be very loyal to their brands. But at some point, that TCO calculation will dominate, right? And then it is the job of the truck manufacturers to be able to offer products at a, like lower price levels that we have today, right? This is going to be an evolution. Batteries are getting expensive. You're learning by doing. But at some point, the difference in price is going to be so significant that it might take away some of those early adopters. And they're coming, right? So 2026, they're already ready to come into the market. There is massive companies in China. One of them is called Sany. They're specialized in construction equipment, but they're huge, right? And they're already announced that they're going to come with a truck in 2026. So it is happening.
Farizon is already in the market.
Right.
And that's exactly the reason why we need a strong European home market, which is why we need to talk about enabling conditions, which is why we need to talk about smart measures that help accelerate demand.
I think we're almost at the end of our time. I wanted to ask a closing question, which is, in a decade's time, when we look back at what's happening, when we look back at this decarbonization process, what do you think will be the single biggest missed opportunity or the smarter decision that we made in this transition?
So for me, the smart decision would be to maintain regulatory certainty, to not open up regulations that have been adopted at the EU level every time that there's a snag somewhere else in the policy framework. But to say, like, if this is not working, weights and dimensions, Eurovignette, whatever it is. Let's go fix this. Let's go work at the national level to fix those things, but not open up the whole EU framework every time something doesn't work.
A combination of everything. So enabling conditions, but opening not just to open, but if we see that it's necessary to open in order to adjust. And also, now coming back to what Jens was saying, for us having options, because electrification is a great choice for many user cases, but not for all. In freight transport, not for all. So it's very important to have technological diversity. So enabling conditions and supporting electrification to a larger scale through smart measures, not demand compulsion, and also leaving us choices for the variety of operations that we're having.
I think from, enabling conditions, all of this is extremely important, but also smart adjustments, refinements, including the CO2 standards when needed. But looking back from 35, for example, to today, I have the feeling that what might have felt painful in 25 will have proven an important instrument a couple of years down the line. So let's try to be bold.
Well, thank you very much. This is all the time that we have. I think the main takeaways that we can have from this panel is the fact that this is a really complex question. There are many parts in this. There is obviously a slowness to the transition. There is a need for enabling infrastructure that is common. There are different opinions on whether forcing or influencing demand and supply is a good idea or not. But we're going to see with the proposal of the greening of corporate fleets what the Commission decides to do, in which direction they decide to go, and then hopefully we get to have another discussion like this after the proposal has been tabled. This is all for us, but please stay seated because we have another session, which is a political research analysis division presentation on energy and AI, titled Black Mirror, Green Crisis, the Energy Cost of Europe, a Transition, by Amanda Crowley and Lucie Denossien, after a quick stage change. Thank you very much.
Thank you.